In this video, we'll talk about the assessment criteria from the official physics guide. And that is to say how your teacher and also external marker grade your IA. If you go to this link and check the physics teacher supporting material, you can find the detail. And this is what your teachers will use for marking your IA at the end. So you can see there will be 5 parts in total, including personal engagement, exploration, analysis, evaluation, and communication. All together will be 24 marks in total. And the whole IA once again would be contribute 20% to your final grade. So here is the details which I will go through it with you. To make it easier to read, I already made another file which you can download from the description below. So here's the file, and I'll go through each of these criteria with you. And the first one is called the personal engagement, PE. And you can see that the highest score you can get is 2. And by the way, you cannot get a point in between. So that is to say you cannot get 0.5 or 1.5, right? At the end, your teacher can only give you either 0, 1, or 2. And in this personal engagement, I would say most of the time, usually from my experience, for half of the class, they will only get 1 mark. I don't think anyone will get 0 as long as you did something. But then for getting a 2, it will require a very holistic idea where when you design a certain experiment, it probably would need to be innovative, original, and also when you are studying the background knowledge, it will be in-depth and also show your significance to the topics. Some people may try to make up some or maybe not, right? But then you may be talking about, oh, I love music and therefore I want to study about maybe the violin. That's why you do this IA. So later on in the exam report, when we read it, you also find the IBO exam board also mentioned this as well. People had misconceptions on personal engagement, thinking that when you try to make a personal story, try to personally link your history to it, it will be helpful. Actually, it's not, right? It is more about how you show passion towards this personal engagement. I usually tell my student that it's something like this. For example, say no matter you are a boy or a girl, say if you like someone, to say, oh, you want a certain person to be your boyfriend or girlfriend, by just saying that, oh, I'm so interested in you or so interested in this IA topic, is pretty useless, right? Because everything about that, everyone would just say, oh, I'm very interested in this. So how to actually show that you love that person or love that topic or research question, it really has to be showing with action or understanding on also how much you understand about this topic, as in for example, how much do you understand that person? For example, oh, what kind of food do they like to eat? What color do they like? What kind of sports do they play or music do they play, etc. So you really have to do background research on whatever you want to study with or whatever you love. Then you just personally be very curious about them. So this is an idea for you to understand the concept of personal engagement. And so throughout the whole IA report, you should show logically, like what are the reasons that you do something or what are the considerations that you have thought of in order to carry out the experiment or making some conclusion or logical deduction. Next, exploration, as known as EX. In this aspect, you may get at most 6 marks. And let's just look at the highest banding here. The first sentence is saying that your topic of investigation is identified and relevant and fully focused. Research question is clearly described. So compared to the middle one, which said it's not fully focused, so you can see that that means you have to clearly say what your research question is. And in fact, I usually would just say put your research question as title. And that should be all right. The other thing is you just have to work well with your supervisor, be communicative, and that shouldn't be a big problem. So this sentence usually would not be a big concern for any student. More importantly, I would say you should pay attention to the second one, which is that the background information provided for the investigation is entirely appropriate and relevant and enhance the understanding of the context of the investigation. So if you compare with the middle band, it said is mainly appropriate and it said aid the understanding. That means if you want to score the highest band, all the formulas or the physics concept, for example, you may try to use the microscopic and macroscopic view to explain something. They both have to be entirely appropriate and relevant to the research question. Sometimes you may not be doing this way. You may be using some other formulas or some other literature value or literature review. For example, maybe some people also did the similar research question like you, and what kind of relationship between the independent variable and dependent variables that they find out. Maybe it is a linear relationship, maybe it is a exponential relationship, etc. So having those information will be relevant and will be appreciated. Next is about the methodology is highly appropriate versus mainly appropriate, and it has considered all of the significant or nearly all of the significant factors which may influence the relevance, reliability and sufficiency of the collected data. So you can see for the middle band, it said only some of the significant factors. So the main thing that I would say that would distinguish these two is when you consider the formula relevance to your research question. So for example, there are factor 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 factors in the formula, and you are studying factor 1 and 2. So for the other three, so number 3, 4, 5, other 3 factor, did you keep them as a control variable? That is to say, keeping them as a constant throughout the whole experiment. And that will be, of course, affecting the reliability of your methodology. So if you forgot to mention about certain control variable, or even if you mention it, you did not do anything to control them, then you will fall into the middle band. So thinking about what are the control variables and try your best to really keep them in a scientific way, in a systematic way, as constant will help you to reach this sentence. Lastly, in your IA, you should leave a part that is called that are safety, ethical and environmental issues, and usually it is behind the procedures of your experiment. This is a part where I find quite some students always forget to include when you submit your first official draft to your supervisor, and this is a big issue for you, because if you think that, oh, I can actually write it later on when I do the final draft, but then usually I would say people will overlook some of the key points. For example, when you think about safety or environmental issue, usually there are some ideas that you could write about, and if you could let your supervisor to take a look, it will be very helpful, right, to remind you maybe, oh, there are some one or two, maybe they cannot tell you directly what those ideas are, but at least they could tell you, hey, there's one or two more ideas you want to look into, or maybe there are certain ways that you can keep it more safe in your experiment. And there are cases where you may find there's really nothing that is dangerous, no environmental issue at all. Usually for physics there's no ethical issue. In that case, I would still recommend you to write this section and then just say it's simply there's nothing related to this issue. Alright, that's also fine as well. But usually I'll recommend to write something. We'll address this section later on in the later video part. If you watch the first part of this YouTube series, you will find in the overview video, I show you this structure, and just now when we talk about exploration, then that should mainly be these subtopics. So including the introduction, framework that is a background research, your pilot study, which is very important, and talking about variables, apparatus, the setup, procedures, and lastly, the ethical, safety, and environmental concern. And now we'll be moving on to the next part called the analysis. Next, analysis, as known as AN. In this part, like the previous, you can get at most 6 marks in total. And let's just look at the first one. The first one is about quantitative and qualitative raw data. And you can see this is saying sufficient, and the middle band saying relevant but incomplete. So again, you have to provide enough raw data. And I would say from my experience, people usually lack of is the qualitative data. And I really want to reiterate, this is very important, because when you submit your IA at the end, even if you want to do it, it is very hard if you forget to do so, because this is something that you really have to pay attention and observe during the time when you do the experiment. If you simply don't know, it is very hard for you to think of some qualitative data. For example, when you do a certain motion study, maybe you drop a certain object over an inclined plane, for example. One qualitative raw data that you may say about, or observation you may say about, is maybe the object is not sliding in a straight line. Maybe it goes sideways and it probably hits the wall of the track of the inclined plane, and that will maybe produce certain friction between the object and the other surface, and therefore it may slow down the object. So this could be one kind of qualitative data that you could talk about, and again, it is really hard for you if you don't pay attention to it. So whenever you do the experiment, you should pay attention to this. And at the end, maybe you will find out your quantitative data is maybe slightly higher or lower than the expected result. For example, when you compare to other people's conclusion or result, maybe you are overestimating or underestimating that. Using the qualitative observation, then you may be able to explain why it is less or more. So for example, back to the example I just mentioned, the friction, then maybe that will be able to match and explain why maybe your quantitative data is some sort of less than expected. So you can say, oh, maybe it's a friction that affects the motion. Next is about the data processing. So you can compare these two sentences. This is saying an accurate data processing to reach the conclusion, and it has to be fully consistent with the data. And the middle band is saying a broadly valid conclusion, and there may be some inconsistency and inaccuracies. So I would say this is more about whether you are careful or not and understanding the whole research question well. As long as you understand the physics concept behind, and there shouldn't be much issue. One thing that you may be able to find helpful is when you're deciding your procedures, that's something related to your exploration, you should have thought of repeating the experiment. So in that case, you may have, say, 3 trials for the same setting, same independent variable. So in that case, you should be able to process them. And with the repeated trial, that will be able to improve your reliability of your data. The next one is about the impact of measurement uncertainty. So you can see the highest band here is that it is full and appropriate consideration, while the middle band says some consideration. So it's really about whether from the beginning, that is to say the raw data, you have considered the absolute uncertainty, and then later on you have to propagate. When you do the process data, you have to use what you learned in chapter 1 to propagate those error. Not only talk about the error itself, the value itself, but also the justification of them. So why do you choose, say, plus or minus 0.1 rather than some other values as well? And of course, then you should consider both x and y, that is the independent variable and dependent variable of the research question. In a case where it is so small that you cannot show on your graph, you still have to explain that it is simply too small in the scale, and that's why you cannot show the error bar on your graph. And lastly, it is about whether the process data is correctly interpreted or you just interpret so that it is a broadly valid but incomplete or limited conclusion. So for this one, we'll explain further in the later video because this is quite complicated. Next, evaluation, that is known as EV. Here it's the same that you can have at most 6 marks. And the first thing is about the conclusion. So you can see the highest band said it is justified by the data presented, and while the middle band is just saying relevant. So that means the main focus is whether or not the conclusion is justified. The main thing that usually your teacher will look into is the graph when you draw the line of best fit, whether or not it is a curve or a straight line or whatever mathematical model you use, whether it is justified by the error bar that you set. And also that may be related to the physical concept as well, which you may refer back to your background research in the earlier section. So that is about how to make your conclusion justify. Next, it is one of the very important parts where you have to compare your conclusion with the accepted scientific context. And you can see in this band, highest band is said it has to be justified, while the middle band just saying some relevant. So whether or not it is closely linked with the literature that you'll find in the background research will be very important. So I would say actually when you started to do or design your research question, it's always the best or making your life much easier if you already find there is a certain literature review that is related to your research question. Ideally, that context you can find from a published scientific paper, maybe from a university or a very reliable source. Some people, poor example could be you just Google a certain personal blog, and or even worst case a certain forum like Reddit. Those are not accepted scientific context. So if you want to be being a performing well in the evaluation, I would say this part, alright, is very crucial, because usually whether or not you can get 5 or 6 all depends on whether you can do this part well. Lastly, there should be a section talking about the strengths and weaknesses of your investigation, including the limitation of data. That could be the range of the independent variable that you cover. So for example, you are studying how the temperature affects a certain parameter, and then maybe the temperature that you did was 20 degrees Celsius to 100 degrees Celsius, while the literature review, other people's research, cover a wider range. So that may be something you can talk about. The other thing would be the sources of error, and that should be a big part of your evaluation, where you should find the most significant error that you could find, no matter it's random error or systematic error. And especially for the part where you will find it can explain, maybe again your data may or your pattern may be overestimating or underestimating from the predicted or expected result. So if you could find those error that can explain like the difference between your experimental data versus the other literature value, it would be nice. Lastly, you should make realistic and relevant suggestions for improvement or extension of the investigation. So comparing to the middle band, you can see there it says some realistic and relevant suggestions. So the basic idea is as many as possible and also as practical as possible. We'll address more into this in the later video. Lastly, communication. So in this aspect, you may get at most 4 marks. And I would say most of the time, as long as you don't have any careless mistake in your calculation, you always show the unit properly with SI unit, and also things like the significance figure and also the decimal place in the table is shown well, and all the graphs, table, image has got the caption, you should at least get 3 marks. Alright, assuming you also follow the structure that I will go through it with you in this video series, then I'm 100% sure that you should get at least 3 or even 4 if you do it well with good terminology language in physics. If you're getting 1 or 2, then there must be some issue, because when marker try to justify why you get this lower band, very likely you have mistake in showing the decimal place, significance figure, or you forgot to label things, or simply your structure is just messy. So communication is about a holistic view of your IA, and as long as you follow through the instruction well, it shouldn't be a big problem. Here is the subject reports for the grade boundary for the internal assessment. So you can see for getting a level 7, you need to reach minimum of 20 marks out of 24 in 2018. Actually, it's the same in 2019 here. For internal assessment grade 7, level 7, you should also get at least 20 marks in order to reach level 7 here. So let's say among all the rubrics, you get 1 out of 2 in personal engagement, 5, which is also the highest band, but not getting a 6, as in maybe you're not being perfect. Same for analysis and evaluation, and getting a 3 in communication. If you add them up together, you will get a 19 out of 24. So it's still unfortunately not meeting level 7, and that is to say you probably have to meet one of these to be full score, while the other will be also in a very high band in order to meet level 7 to get 20 marks or above in total. In the next video, we'll talk more about the details from the exam report, that is more specific feedback from the IBO markers from the past years.